right, everyone, it is 2 after the hour. I am notoriously impatient, so let's get going with our conversation today. I want to say welcome back to those of you who attended our first session of the Back to the Basics series about building relationships with voters in person. This is the second in our 3-part series where we are going back to the basics of election communication. So during the last session, we talked about how to find the right events to attend and get ready to show up in person. For this conversation, we're going to be talking about the basics of digital communications. Feel free to use the Q&A function throughout the presentation today to ask any questions that come to mind, and we'll do our best to address them at the end of the conversation. We're talking today about the basics of digital communication. We'll go through the importance of having an accurate website, the difference between different social media platforms, and how to strategize about when, where, and how often to update your content. So I want to take a step back and talk about what I mean when I say digital communication. It can mean a lot of things. For the purpose of this conversation, I'll say that digital communication includes any information that you send or receive online. Specific channels could be social media, websites, text messages, email, or even artificial intelligence. Because we only have an hour together today, we're going to focus on websites and social media, though you should absolutely let us know if there are other digital communication topics you'd like to cover in a future session. Next week, our last session of this series will focus on building community partnerships to sustain your work. And before we go into the specifics of the presentation today, I first want to introduce the fantastic team that will be presenting today. This group of people have collectively spent hundreds of hours thinking about how to make election communication as simple as possible. And we hope that the tips, resources, and best practices we share today will help you to go beyond the basics of digital communication. So I'm going to turn it over to Taryn. Why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
All right, great. Hi, everyone. It's great to be with you today. My name is Taryn Dwyer, and I'm a Senior Training Associate from the Center for Tech and Civic Life, where I and my colleague Christian focus a great deal on creating resources that are helpful for local election officials in implementing and administering elections. So really happy to be here to talk about digital comms today.
Thanks, Taryn. Why don't you go ahead, Christian?
Yeah, thank you. And hello, folks. My name is Christian Franco. I am one of the other senior training associates with the Center for Tech and Civic Life, and I get to work with Taryn every single day, which is a blessing.
Yes, definitely. Alton, do you want to go ahead?
Hi, I'm Alton Dillard. I'm a communications consultant for the elections group. We too provide resources to election officials to make sure that we're not reinventing the wheel, making sure that especially if your jurisdiction doesn't have like a lot of time or people you can spend on communications, to be able to have templates and guides available for you to carry out your mission. And I'm also a former U.S. Senate press secretary and spent 17 years as the communications manager at the Denver County Clerk and Recorder. So I'll be chiming in with some anecdotes to sort of go ahead with the information we'll be presenting today. Thank you.
Thank you, Alton. And my name is Leah Weintraub. I am with Ideas 42, where I use behavioral science to help voters to follow through on their intention to cast a ballot. For the past 2 years, I have partnered with a lot of election offices similar to yours to help to simplify voter outreach. So let's talk through the agenda for today. We'll start out by talking about why digital communication is important for election offices. Then the team from the Center for Tech and Civic Life will walk us through creating and maintaining websites. We'll then talk about social media, including how to decide what platform to use and how to post successfully on various social media channels. Then we'll go into the importance of building connections between channels, and we'll introduce the concept of a call to action. No worries if you've never heard of that, we'll talk through it. So we'll sum up at the end of the presentation and talk about the steps that you can take to go beyond the basics. I want to pause on this statistic for a second. 86% of people in the United States get at least some of their news from a device, whether that is a phone, a tablet, or a computer. That means that having information online is a virtual necessity for those of us who want to reach our audience where they are. When it comes to social media, most US adults use Facebook and YouTube, and about half use Instagram. We'll go more into all of these platforms later on. But I know what you're thinking. It's all well and good that people are online and on social media, but how do I know that they want to hear from me there? Well, that's a great question. The good folks over at the Bipartisan Policy Center did some polling and found that US adults look mostly to social media and television, both national and local, for election information. This isn't surprising. The White House just did a study and found that digital is the preferred way that people want to interact with government. The benefits from digital communication are different from print or in-person interactions. First, digital communication offers opportunities for engagement. Many forms of digital communication are actually conversations, and I'm going to come back to this point so much throughout our conversation today. There are opportunities for you to respond quickly to voters online, whether it's by replying to an email or engaging in the comments on a social media post. The connective element of digital communication is especially important for new voters or voters in places where there have been changes in how elections are managed. These are cases when voters feel uncertainty about where or how to cast their ballot. And one of the best things that you can do for voters in this situation is to show that you're available to help. Having a regular presence on social media or including your email address on your materials shows that you're accessible to voters to help them to navigate the election process. Digital communication is also fast, which means that you can get information to voters quickly. The rapid pace for being able to update voters in your jurisdiction is important when you're deep in election season and could have urgent information to get out to voters. With digital communication, you can send information to voters in just a few clicks, and you also don't have to pay, which is a real benefit of it. I'm thinking of an interaction that I had with an election official in Colorado who said that in the heat of election season, she's often just filming videos of herself to post on social media because the context is changing so quickly and it's the fastest way for her to interact with her voters. So the speed is a real benefit for you all. Ultimately, digital communication can be a two-way conversation that helps to build trust in your office. And the more that you're able to communicate factual, timely information to voters, the more you will be seen as a trusted source for election-related information. All right, I'm going to turn it over, I believe, to Christian.
Yeah, actually, Taryn, you want to take this slide?
Yeah, I'll start us off and then I'll hand it off to you. So we're going to start off by talking about election websites, which can be a really important primary source of election information for your voters and in your community. So we know that there are endless possibilities for how to design a website, but we know that not everybody is able to get super technical with designing a site. There are some basic qualities, though, that you might want to consider as the foundation of a successful website, whether you've got a lot of website or IT support or not. First, a successful site should establish your office as an official source of information, a thread we've been following throughout the series. Second, your site should address common questions you may expect from community members. And third, you should aim to make your site as easy to read and navigate as possible. Those three items, I think, are the crux of a really successful site. So I'm going to toss it over to Christian, who works with election officials and websites every day, who's going to talk a little bit more about how to do these things in detail.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Leah, for the intro, and thank you, Taryn. Like we mentioned, you might want to put in a little bit of work to make sure that your election department is immediately recognizable as an official source of information. That means doing things like setting up HTTPS and .gov for your election website. Setting up a .gov domain makes it easy to identify a real site, since you have to be a verified government organization to get approved. Additionally, consider adding aspects to your website like a seal for your county, municipality, or city, having info about the upcoming election prominently displayed, and showing photos of your staff, and including contact information for getting in touch with your office. Contact information is an easy but important way to demonstrate that you're trustworthy. So place it prominently on your website, social media accounts, and all other materials. And maybe most importantly, in addition to visually signifying that you're a trusted source of information, you need to actually have a history of publishing useful, accurate information on a regular basis. So when we talk about regularly updating information on your website, what information should you be thinking about? According to research done by the Center for Civic Design, the top questions for voters are: what is on the ballot? How do I get an absentee ballot and when is it due? Where do I vote? Who is in office now? And how do I register to vote? And the top question for non-voters is a bit more basic. It's: how do I participate in an election? Election websites should make the answers to these questions easy to find for voters. One of the easiest ways you can make sure your website is easy to read is by writing in plain language. Plain language is writing designed to ensure the reader understands as quickly, easily, and completely as possible. Some simple guidelines for plain language include writing in the positive, telling people what to do instead of what not to do, using the active rather than passive voice. One simple way to do that is to address the reader directly. You should also use short words, statements, and sections. For example, the word use instead of utilize may make things just a bit easier to read. And then finally, just consider using words you know voters may be looking for and avoid jargon if possible. In addition to plain language, you can also consider the principles of plain design if you have the ability or capacity to adjust your website. That might mean doing things like using white space to manage content, having really effective menus and headings, using lists instead of long paragraphs of text, aligning content to the left to allow for skimming, using a clear sans serif font that's easy to read, and having strong contrast between the text and the background. And before we move on from websites, we wanted to show two examples of local election website homepages. This first homepage is a typical election website, which has some pros and cons. But while it offers a bunch of election information, you can see that this homepage is busy, it's wordy, it's cluttered, it can feel overwhelming when you first log in and this is what you're greeted with, which just makes it challenging for voters to find the info that they need. Now let's look at a second example. This one, you can see it's more simple. It has a great use of icons, it's clean, it's easy to look at. Overall, it does a better job of using plain design and plain language elements. While you may not have the capacity to completely change or redesign your website, these tips can help ensure you're doing what you can to make the information easily accessible to the public. And if you're interested in redesigning your website with some support, we'll talk a little bit later about an available website template in the resources section. And with that, I believe I'm going to pass it over to Alton.
Yes, I just wanted to reinforce a few things and make a couple of other points. Another thing, going back to what Leah mentioned about how a lot of people get their information on these days, make sure your website is mobile optimized, because what you don't want is for someone to pull that information up, but they can only see a quarter of what you're talking about on the screen, and they have to scroll sideways, up and down, etc. And the other reason that we're having this series at this time, because we know everyone's going to be getting really busy heading into the November cycle. So that's why we're talking about a lot of these principles here in June to try to provide some runway. Also, on a website, you also want to make sure that it is accessible. And there are resources out there also that show you how to make your website accessible to, say, someone who may have a visual impairment and need to use a screen reader. But another useful tool is language accessibility. Now, not every jurisdiction's under Section 203 of the Voting Rights Act, but at minimum, if you use the little Google language pull down, it's not going to be 100% accurate. There are regionalisms, there are dialects, we understand that, but it will give you the opportunity to be able to be a resource to your voters who may be English as a second language. Another thing that I want to reinforce is what Christian said about use of jargon. It's so easy in the world of elections to start talking about LATs and UACAVA and this, that, and the other thing. Just, our military and overseas voters, that kind of language really also helps humanize it. And then one other handy tip to talk about what Christian was talking about having accurate information. You also want updated recent information. So I also do a little bit of political analysis for a couple of the TV stations here in town. And I was researching a county website trying to find who was on the ballot for an upcoming election. And they still had their November election information up there. So good practice is once your election is finalized, once you're through audit, once you're through your post-election risk limiting audit, if you conduct that, once your election results are official, I always suggest leaving them in place for maybe a week to 10 days and then flipping your website to your next election. Thanks.
Fantastic, Alton. Thank you so much. So we're going to pivot away from websites and start with the wonderful world of social media. So we're going to start with Facebook. Facebook popularized the concept of a social network. It began as a platform that only allowed people to create a profile for themselves as a person. And a user could send a friend request to someone in their network, and once that request was accepted, they could see each other's posts. So there was a level of reciprocity on the platform. So a post can include text, photos, and videos. Now Facebook has developed in such a way that it allows something called pages, which are not for people, but rather for organizations, offices, and businesses, like your election office. Some of you likely have Facebook pages for your office, others might not. If you're creating a page, you simply go to a Facebook profile, so that's for a person, and then you can create a page if you don't have one already. If you are associated with a page, you can invite people to like it. Once they like the page, they can see posts from that page on their newsfeed. It's really, really important to encourage people in your jurisdiction to like your page, since that helps them to see the content that you post. So a little more about Facebook. 68% of US adults indicate that they use Facebook, according to research from Pew. This number has stayed pretty consistent since 2016, and except for YouTube, no other platform comes even close to Facebook in its popularity. All demographic groups are pretty comparable in their use of Facebook nationally, though there is some slight variation based on identity. For example, women are more likely to be users than men at 76% and 59% of the population, respectively. And unlike many social media platforms, there is a high number of users across all age groups on Facebook, while some that we'll discuss later on tend to skew younger. Roughly 3 in 10 US adults say they get news from Facebook. This is the social media site that US adults most often turn to for news. In a 2023 survey also done by Pew, they found that 43% of Facebook users regularly get news on the site. These folks tend to skew female and older than people who get news on other social media platforms. They're also evenly divided between Democrats and Republicans. Now, here's the tricky thing about Facebook. They're constantly updating their metrics to determine who sees what. See, at any point, there are thousands of pieces of content that any user could see in their feed. That could be content that their friends or the pages that they like post. It could also be content from paid advertisements, which are not necessarily from pages that a Facebook user likes. To determine what goes to the top of the list, Facebook uses a few metrics, including how much the user has engaged with a page in the past, how much engagement a post is getting from other users, how past content from an account has performed with users, how recently something was posted, and if the post type, so like if it's a video or a link, etc., is the type of content that a user prefers. This can make it pretty challenging for information from a local election office to make it to the top of the list, especially if not that many people like your page. But all hope is not lost. During an election period, Facebook allows election offices to send voters alerts announcing relevant election information to everyone who likes their page. These are called voting alerts. They're similar to local alerts that you can send out, like if there's an earthquake or a natural disaster in your area. We don't have time during this conversation to talk about how to set up those voting alerts, but we've linked to a resource at the end of the presentation and we'll send that out after the fact. So that's a really powerful way that you can alert every single person who likes your page about relevant voting information. Now, we've gone through the basics of Facebook, and now the question is, how do I make a good post? You'll see on the screen here a mock post that I created, and we're going to talk through a few elements within it that make it successful. First, there's a graphic. Posts with an image get 50% more likes than posts that just have text. And if you have the capability to put video on Facebook, that tends to be even better. So as a rule of thumb, use content that is visual and grabs attention. And for graphics specifically, not all are created equal. Try to minimize the amount of text or visual clutter on your graphic so that it makes a Facebook user stop scrolling and pause on your content. Simple text and images indicate why a message is relevant without making your audience have to work too hard. For text, some official sources say that you should only have text cover about a quarter of an image. I don't think that you have to be too strict with this. The importance is just that the design is visually simple and engaging. I'll note that the image that is included in this post was generated using Votercast, which we talked about in the last conversation, and is a tool to help you generate content to put up on various forums, including social media. So there's also the subject of logo and county name. Christian went into this a little bit when talking about websites, that it's really important to credential yourself so that voters know that information is coming from an official source. Luckily, when you set up your page, it likely prompted you to include your logo and the name of your office. So that information will load automatically when you create a Facebook post. Now let's talk about captions. I already mentioned that text on a graphic itself should be pretty sparse. Ideally, it should be enough of a signal to get people to stop and learn more from the caption. The caption is where you can include more information about the next step that you want your audience to take. So take this post, for example. The graphic content is meant to signal that there is an election coming up. And then when someone reads the caption, they learn that the first step that they can take is to register or update their registration. So captions are a great place to include links to more information. Now I want to talk about alt text, which is this little gray box on the graphic. And I'll note that it normally would not appear on the post. I just included it here so that you know that it's present. Alt text increases the accessibility of your content. It's text that describes what is on the visual. This text is read aloud via a screen reader and is indexed in search engines. In alt text, it's important to describe both the visual and language elements on a graphic. And as much as possible, keep it simple and descriptive so that people can understand what's included in the image. And in terms of what to post on Facebook, a really important category are public service announcements. So an announcement that a registration deadline is coming up, for example. These are topics that voters in your jurisdiction need to know to successfully cast a ballot. Another great idea to post about is an event. If you're planning on attending a community event or you're hosting an event on your own, it's great to put it on Facebook so people know where to show up or where to find you. I am going to turn it over to Alton now to share a little bit more about Facebook.
Yeah, when it comes to Facebook, one thing that's very important is make sure that you have a contact at Facebook's government desk. So usually those are set up like regionally. And the reason I bring that up, Leah talked about some of the new things that Facebook has done over the past year and a half or so. But if you just flash back to the last couple of election cycles, when they essentially were the inadvertent purveyors of mis and disinformation, they essentially went with a baby out with the bathwater kind of analogy, where they flagged anything from a government entity as political. And so next thing you know, basic information posts with voter information were being disapproved. And I'm not exaggerating when I say that that would go all the way down to a county that would be having a plant sale at their county greenhouse. That's how sensitive it got. So anytime you get hung up, make sure that you have a contact at your local, your regional governmental desk for Facebook. Another thing that when it comes to the accessibility, just like we talked about with websites, and again, that's one of the themes that I'm always going to hit during the courses this series is scalability. We understand that not everyone has giant communications teams. Some of y'all may be in small jurisdictions where there's only 3 or 4 of you doing elections, marriage licenses, motor vehicle, however your jurisdiction is set up. But if you do some of these just little simple things, it still puts you in the stream of information. So just like I talked about in the last section, also think in terms of language accessibility. So even though you may not have the time or capacity to translate everything, if you do have the ability on a social post, at least when it has something to do with the 5 W's, election dates, registration deadlines, really basic information, especially if you're a Section 203 county, that really goes a long way towards illustrating that you want to be inclusive of all. And that, I think, is about it for me on the Facebook session. So I'll toss it back. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alton. All right, we're going to go on and talk about YouTube. YouTube is an alphabet company focused on videos. Some of you might be surprised to see that I'm including YouTube here, since it's a website for seeking out videos. Yet it is technically considered social media because users generate content that they can share with a wide audience. Besides Facebook, YouTube is the most widely used social media platform. A whopping 83% of US adults say they ever use YouTube. Usership is high across all age groups, but especially adults ages 18 to 49, almost 95% of whom say that they use YouTube. That number goes down to 60% for folks 65 years and up. Usership skews slightly more urban and college educated, but it's high across identities. 26% of US adults turn to it for news, making it the second most popular social media site for news. Of course, this is all going to be video news. YouTube relies upon data of what a user has watched, what pages someone subscribes to, and what they have searched for to determine what to recommend. If you have a page for your office on YouTube, you can invite people to subscribe to the page, which is similar to what exists on Facebook, but it's much less predictable or predictive that someone would see your content. In all likelihood, someone will see your video because their search query matches the title of your video. It also helps, of course, if your video has a lot of engagement. I'm going to show you a short snippet from an informational video from the Secretary of State of Texas.
Hello, Texans. I'm Texas Secretary of State John Scott. Welcome to the second installment of SOS 101. Today, you'll be learning about voting systems in Texas, including why we use them, how they are certified, and how laws and regulations in the state of Texas help ensure that your vote is secure. Let's start with a short history lesson. In 2002, the U.S. Congress passed the Help America Vote Act, known as HAVA, which was a major overhaul in the way our country ran elections for over 2 centuries. Among other reforms, HAVA created the U.S. Election Assistance Commission, or the EAC. It oversees the certification of voting systems at the federal level. HAVA also provided funding and processes for state and local governments to purchase electronic voting systems, which help improve efficiency and accuracy in elections and allow people with disability to privately and independently cast a ballot. Each voting system has to undergo rigorous testing, certification, and recertification by the EAC in order to be legally used in a U.S. election. In Texas, we have even higher standards for our voting systems, which must be certified by our office in conjunction with computer science experts and legal experts at the Texas Attorney General's office.
All right. So one thing that you'll notice from this video is that it has a pretty simple setup. The Secretary of State is speaking to the camera, a technique we call face to camera. Being able to see a face connected with an election office humanizes your work and inspires trust. It can be pretty easy to do face to camera. So you'll see that the Secretary of State of Texas has probably someone with a camera set up across his desk, but I know some election officials who will just literally hold up their cell phone like this and look at it. I also like this video because it breaks down complicated terms into plain language and shows an image of each concept being described. You don't need to include images in your video. The most important thing is that you describe complicated subjects in terms that voters can understand. So I bet you're wondering, out of all of the videos that I could have included, why this one? So in an experiment conducted by academics from the University of California, San Diego after the 2022 midterm elections, they found that watching a video from an election official led voters to have greater trust in the accuracy and integrity of elections. This video in particular increased the percentage of respondents who reported that they trusted their own state's elections by 13 percentage points, which is the largest impact of any of the videos that they tested in the experiment. So YouTube is a great platform to visually show how processes work in your office or explain complicated topics. Videos can be pretty lengthy, like this one. I don't know if you see on the screen here that this is a 7-minute long video, but the benefits of YouTube is that it gives you the space to explain complexity or to add nuance to your presentation. Alton, do you want to chime in here?
I do, because one of the other things, just to co-sign with what Leah is saying, is you have to remember our societal attention span now. That's why anything that moves you away from presenting information in a text-only way is so key. So like in my former jurisdiction, we created a series of ballot processing videos. And I know, again, you're thinking, oh, man, do we have the bandwidth, et cetera, et cetera. We actually, all we used was a cell phone and essentially an Adobe editing suite to be able to drop a little music and put a graphic on top of it. Because the other thing, especially when it comes to voter information, when you are in a busy time, you have to ask yourself the question, do I want to be conducting elections or do I want to be answering the phone? The more information that you put out and knowing what your call drivers are gives you the ability to do anything from a lengthy video like this to even a 45-second walkthrough. And the other theme that you're going to hear throughout as we cover this and social media, again, putting that human face on it. And the thing with video is it does not have to be slickly produced. That's one of the misconceptions about the use of video when it comes to using it as a communications tool. Slick produced videos are nice, but again, you want to be able to illustrate, you want to show the face, you want to make sure if you're an elected and appointed position or you're a management position, but also it's handy if you're subject matter experts who are hands-on, whether it's the person who runs your vote counting room or the person who recruits your election judges. If they are comfortable appearing on camera, a lot of voters like to see the people and the worker bees who are behind the scenes.
Awesome. Thanks, Alton. So we're going to speed through the next couple social media sites, the first of which is Instagram. Instagram is a visual first platform that's owned by the same company that owns Facebook. So while Facebook supports text heavy posts, Instagram is visual first. I'm going to keep on saying this because it is a platform for sharing photos and increasingly videos as well. It definitely allows for captions, but the visual content is king. Users typically see content from pages that they follow, similar to subscribing on YouTube or liking on Facebook pages. In terms of who uses Instagram, the user base skews younger than Facebook. Only 47% of the overall population uses Instagram, but that number jumps to 78% of 18 to 29-year-olds. For comparison, 59% of 30 to 49-year-olds use it, and only 35% of 50 to 64-year-olds. Usership also skews female. So on Instagram, the content should again be focused on visuals. If you're doing videos on Instagram, it's different than if you're doing videos on YouTube. Whereas YouTube allows for complexity and explanation, on Instagram, videos tend to be pretty stylized. They're short, they're designed, they're meant to entertain people. Indeed, most people who use Instagram go on the platform because they want to be entertained. They want funny content or beautiful content or things that help them to turn their brain off. So it's different than a platform like Facebook that people turn to for news. And users typically only see content from accounts that they follow. Within that, Instagram has an algorithm to determine the popularity of a post in general, and how often a user has interacted with the account that posted. Because of this, it can be hard to reach people who do not follow your account. And even those who do follow your account might not see the content that you post if there are other accounts that they engage with more readily. So Instagram has two different types of content, posts and stories. Each can be a video or a photo. So stories appear in those little bubbles at the top of the screen, but I'm not really going to talk about them. They're basically content that disappears after 24 hours. You'll probably be doing more posts. So posts appear on what's called your grid on your profile page in perpetuity. A lot of the content is square, but they increasingly allow for different image formats. And, you know, a lot of the same principles of Facebook posts apply. So visually engaging graphic, direct and clear language. But I will note that for Instagram, there is no ability to include links in the captions. I'm going to move ahead and talk about X. In case you're unfamiliar, X is the platform that was formerly known as Twitter. I still want to call it Twitter all the time, so I might slip up today. But it was rebranded when Elon Musk came in as CEO in November of 2022. And X is a conversation-first platform. Similar to Instagram, you can follow accounts without needing there to be reciprocation, and you get updated from the content that those account holders are posting. Since Musk took the helm, reports say that use of the platform has gone down by as much as 30%. Pew indicates that 22% of US adults use X. This number skews heavily younger, with 42% of 18 to 29-year-olds and 27% of 30 to 49-year-olds saying that they use X. These are pretty similar demographics to Instagram, but there's, of course, a real difference in content. Whereas Instagram users go to the platform to share photos and videos and be entertained, X users go to the platform for news. Half of users indicate that they get news on X. And time is of the essence to determine who sees what on X. Recency is the greatest predictor of whether someone sees your content, though with changes to the platform, X is increasingly relying on an algorithm that predicts how relevant content is to a person, similar to the other platforms we discussed. But a user will see your posts if it was posted near the time that they're going on the platform. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about the anatomy of a successful post on X, since many of the same principles remain. What I will note is that you should keep your posts short. X only allows posts of 280 characters, and that limit sneaks up on you real fast. While photos aren't as common on X, you can still use them. They help your content to be eye-catching on a very text-heavy platform. X is great for posting breaking news because of how it prioritizes recency. X is often the platform people turn to if they want to hear about developing stories. And Alton, anything to add here?
Yes, a couple things. One, especially when it comes to X, people have a tendency to get caught up in the number of followers that they have. And the main thing with X is you also want to factor in engagement. So I am a big fan of the hashtags. So how that works, you see the hashtag in the example, Trusted Info 2024. Even if someone is not following you, but they may be following that hashtag, it puts you in the conversation. And so also remember that all of these platforms that we're talking about are to engage conversation and engagement with your voters. And so one of the cautions that I put out is there are ways on all of these to schedule posts. That's fine for this kind of deadline related stuff, but I always like to put a little caution out there because sometime, to Leah's point, there's other kinds of news that is breaking. And then you may have something cutesy teed up that you forgot about because you scheduled it a month ago. And then it may hit at a time where something of, a national tragedy, like you said, an earthquake, a forest fire, whatever's going on, and it may make you appear tone deaf. So I'm always a little cautionary about scheduling posts too far ahead. And the last thing I have on Twitter, X, whatever we call it, is just the fact that it's a great way to, again, humanize. So again, we understand that people have different levels of comfort with their name or their face, appearing on social media, especially these days. But I'm going to give a quick example of the humanizing factor. At my old jurisdiction, the one tweet or post is what they now call them that went viral had nothing to do with the conduct of the election. One of my colleagues got stuck in an elevator and was rescued by 5 handsome firefighters. We posted a picture of her and the firefighters and all their gear on, And that got much more engagement than anything we ever put out having to do with the election. So again, put a human face using social media on what you do so people don't think that government is just a bunch of faceless bureaucrats.
Thanks, Alton. All right, we're going to move on. So there's a reason that the internet is called a web. It's a connective platform that works best when it's driving people from page to page. So let's take a little example here. You want to let voters know that the deadline to request a mail ballot is coming up in a week. So you put up a Facebook post. That post includes a link to the voter registration page. So a voter can click on that link and register to vote. From there, you have a page after someone has registered that says thank you and encourages people to tell their friends and family to register or update their registration. So let's say that the person clicks on the Facebook link and generates a post. Then it brings them back to Facebook, and perhaps the cycle begins for someone else. I give this example to show that the best content online drives viewers to take action. In internet marketing speak, this is called a call to action. The first Facebook post was successful because it drove people to the registration page. And once they registered, the page included a call to action for people to share that they registered with their network on social media. This page then brings people back to social media where they can encourage their friends and family to vote and restart that call to action cycle. Now, I've listed out a few commonly asked questions and we'll talk through the answers. The first is, how do I choose what platform to use? So it's not like Sue is on Facebook and Bob is on Twitter. A lot of users are actually on multiple platforms, and you can be too. We recommend having multiple accounts across platforms so that voters are more likely to see your materials, even through repetition. That's great. When determining what to post on each platform, follow the demographic profile of who tends to be using that site and the shortcuts of what content is typically posted on that site. So if you want to make people feel entertained or have a sense of humor, Instagram might be best, whereas breaking news might be best on X. In terms of how often to post, that depends on the time of year or the type of year that you're operating within. The most important thing is to maintain consistency. Post at regular intervals. It's okay to do some testing to figure out what time of day might work best or how often might work best, but once you figure out your rhythm, maintain it. And on the subject of consistency, not only should your posting amount be consistent, but so should the visual style of the materials. That way, people can recognize that something comes from your office. The consistent branding is really important. Many offices also swear by having a content calendar. This is just a calendar where you plan out what you want to have on each day. But again, as Alton said, you don't ever know what event might be coming up on that day. So content calendars should include a level of flexibility. And lastly, what do I do about the comments? This is something that I get a lot from election offices. And what I'll say is that part of what makes social media social is that it creates a conversation. People have the opportunity to engage with your content, either by reacting to it with a like or other emoji, or by leaving a comment. This can present opportunities to deepen engagement with constituents, but it can also present challenges when the comments include false information or start arguments. I want to stress here that I get it. It can feel scary to get on social media knowing that it could open you up to people who want to post hateful content online. Even though it seems challenging, the benefits of reaching users with credible information can make the downsides worth it. Try to respond to comments promptly with helpful information or reactions. You do also have options for how to handle actively harmful or dangerous comments on your page if they appear. First, it is possible to block someone from seeing your page. It is also possible to prevent content containing certain words from appearing on your page on certain platforms like Facebook. We'll follow up with a link with more information about how to do this. So I just threw a lot at you about social media, and Taryn and Christian shared a lot with you about websites. If we're to distill it down into 4 quick bullets, it's maintain consistency in your timing and your style, show the credibility of your office that will lead voters to trust what you're sharing. Social media is a conversation. Engage in the back and forth as much as you can. And the internet is all about actions, driving people to follow through on intentions or encouraging them to visit a different page. Now I'm going to hand it over to Taryn.
Thanks, Leah, and thanks to Alton and Christian as well for sharing so much information on the foundation of digital comms. This is, of course, a course on the foundation of digital communications, but we wanted to highlight some tips and resources you might be interested in for going beyond the basics as we close. First, we wanted to uplift some of the resources that Leah and Alton mentioned on Facebook throughout the presentation, which includes links to resources for setting up voting alerts, creating post rules, and the link to Meta support for government officials and offices. Additionally, here's some more general resources or specific resources on comms in general. We've highlighted a webinar series from us at CTCL here called Communicating Trusted Election Information. This 6-course series covers topics across digital, in-person, and media communication, including a course on improving your election website and a course on social media for voter engagement. I also want to flag that there's a course in this series on combating election misinformation. That's a new self-paced version, an updated self-paced version that exists on our website that you can take at your leisure. It dives into a lot of great detail on some of those final notes Leah was mentioning around election misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation. So encourage folks to check that out. We also have VoterCast listed here, which Leah mentioned earlier as well. VoterCast is a product of Ideas 42 that generates professionally designed, ready-to-use voter communications materials that can aid you across all 3 topic areas in this webinar series, but especially in your digital communications. Next, we've got the election group's communications resource desk, where you can request tailored, free, or low-cost communications assistance. And last but not least, a few things to look out for from the U.S. Alliance for Election Excellence. The Alliance is a nonpartisan collaborative that brings together election officials to rally around a set of common values and standards, support each other, and keep their skills fresh. Election offices from around the country participate alongside designers, technologists, and other experts. I want to make sure that I noted both the communication standards developed by the Alliance and communication resources featured by the Alliance. So here we've got some information on the standards. The Alliance has brought together local election officials from across the country in jurisdictions large and small to help create standards for excellence in U.S. election administration. These nonpartisan standards aim to support local election officials, improve election websites, I'm so sorry, I've got websites on the mind, improve election operations, and build public trust. Standards are being continuously developed on key areas of election administration, and we want to highlight a few that are especially relevant for today's session. We've got plain language, which means that your office speaks in ways that allows voters to easily find, understand, and use the information they need. We've got information design, which means your office uses design and accessibility best practices to format information so that it's easy to find, understand, and use. And finally, we've got voter communications, which may look like your office effectively distributing information through a variety of methods to reach voters in many ways, which might include various digital outlets like we mentioned today. You can learn more about these and other standards, or even give feedback on these standards. And if you're interested, please visit electionexcellence.org. And in addition to creating standards, the Alliance has also created an online library of a variety of nonpartisan generic resources related to various standards. So in addition to tools like VoterCast, there are lots of other resources included in the library that might be helpful for going beyond the basics of digital communications. In this session today, we talked about updating your election website, so we wanted to highlight some relevant resources, or at least this relevant resource from the library. The election website template was developed by our friends at US Digital Response in partnership with us at the Center for Tech and Civic Life, based on our user experience research by the Center for Civic Design. The website template is built upon years of research on how voters seek information online. This site is easy to use, mobile-friendly, secure, and a great fit for any election department, large or small, urban or rural. Where permitted, free support is provided by the Center for Tech and Civic Life to help any election official set up the website, regardless of your technical skills. Where free support is not permitted, CTCL provides basic technical setup support for $500. You can learn more about this tool and see the rest of the Alliance's guides, generic communications templates, and more by visiting electionexcellence.org/resources. We also wanted to highlight a couple of additional resources featured by the Alliance, including a checklist for combating election misinformation, which also includes some pretty explicit directions on how to set up HTTPS and .gov for your website. So take a look at that along with the other resources on the screen, Civic Icons and Images resource, a field guide to ensuring voter intent, VoterCast again, and voter outreach graphics, and more on the Alliance website, again, by visiting electionexcellence.org/resources. All right, and that brings us to the end of our planned content. And I'm going to go ahead. We've got a handful of questions for the Q&A. So let's go ahead and address some of those. I'm going to open up here and let's go with this easy question first. Somebody asked if we could share the name of or the link to the research paper about election official YouTube videos and increasing public trust. I think that's a good question for you, Leah. Would you be able to share that link out?
Definitely. We'll send that in the follow-up email.
Awesome. Thank you. All right, let's go ahead to this question on Twitter and X. So what tips do we have for writing a caption when there are character limits?
I can get started with this one. Something I like to do when I'm writing captions is to actually have the Twitter app open at the time. And because they have a countdown, or like the countdown of the characters, so I can actually see if I'm fitting into the character limit and see what it would look like within the platform. That's my best tip. If anyone else has anything else to add.
Yeah, and then also this also goes back to the importance of making sure that your website is tightened up, because I usually would just provide a short caption and then a hyperlink back to the responsive part of the website, whether it had to do with deadlines, voter registration, when the voter information guide comes out, etc. And another good tip is you can also use a free URL shortener, and you can come up with like just little custom vanity URLs that help you shorten the actual content. But that's why we were harping on the visual part so much, because again, our societal attention span is all over the place. So anytime you can use a visual to illustrate the content, the better.
I'd also add really quickly at the end too, that this is one of the areas where plain language really comes in strong. So again, if you're using shorter and easier to understand words, again, Christian used the example of use versus utilize, that can really help be mindful of the character limit when you're writing a post, in addition to all these other tips that have been shared. So thanks, everyone. We've got another question here that I think is related. This person asked, I've heard that social media apps are moving away from steering users to establish media outlet channels. It seems like communication channels to reach residents is becoming more and more fractured. Any tips for how to overcome this? I would just start by reiterating what Alton just said about linking to your website in posts, but also keeping a link to your website in your bio if that's available, which is available on sites like Facebook or X. But anything else you all want to add about overcoming the challenge of fractured communication digitally?
Yeah, the other thing, and that's a very good question, because we're going to cover in our next session, the one about building partnerships, how media interplays with this. But one thing I can tell you just in the context of this webinar is more and more people in media are actually using social media that you put out as the reference point and the information. So I can't think of the last time in the tail end of my career that I even wrote a press release, because in my market here in Denver, the media would simply link to your Twitter talking about such and such, or they would pull the video showing your walkthrough of your voting processes. So there is a bit of a synergy there, and we can talk about this more in the next webinar. But one of the things that is important is because of contraction in media, you really have to rely on yourselves to tell your own story with media as a partner, but you have to be the primary arbiter of the information.
Thanks so much for responding to that. All right, let's see what other questions we've got. I think this is a good question here too. Is X still a safe platform for election offices since the exposure of internal moderation discussions?
I have to admit that I'm unfamiliar with this. So if anyone wants to share more with me after the fact, you absolutely should. In terms of whether X is a safe place for election offices or a place to prioritize, in my humble opinion, the other platforms offer better resources for you all right now. I think that X, because it's reaching such a small subset of the population currently, you can reach a wider swath of your voters on other platforms. So, if you're on the fence about going with X and you have some concerns, I think that you can, think about putting those resources into other platforms. That's not to say that it's not useful to be on the site, because you're certainly reaching voters, especially if you're sending out just alerts about, upcoming election information. But you can certainly do so on other platforms as well.
And from the safety aspect, again, understanding how fraught the world of elections administration is, there are ways to work with people, and again, determine their comfort level with having their face out there. But the thing that I always harp on is make sure, regardless of if people want their names and faces floating around on social media, that you're highlighting the work. You want to show that the work is being done. So there are ways to work around that. So even like with the, you keep using the example of walking someone through your ballot processing areas using a little video tour. There are ways to shoot people from behind, so you're not exposing their identity. Or if somebody is working on a process, as long as you're not exposing any PII or voter information, you can do hand close-ups to show people working a keyboard or ballots blurring through a ballot scanner. Things like that are what really sort of takes elections administration out of the black box. Safety is definitely a concern. So what I always would do, I would go even in announcing what I'm doing. Anytime I'd go into a ballot processing room, I would say, hey, we're getting ready to, bring a news crew in here, or hey, we're getting ready to do a social media. And if people are not interested in that, they would just simply let the room lead know, and the room lead would send that election judge on a 5-minute break. So safety is definitely something that you want to pay close attention to, but I'm always going to highlight, make sure that you're still illustrating the great work that you're doing, even if the people don't want to show their face while doing the great work.
Yeah, and I think I'll add here at the end that it's important to, do whatever internal work or processes you have for assessing whether or not it would be a safe platform for your office. So if you've got in-house legal counsel, if this is a decision that you would need to make with other folks in your jurisdiction, like a board of supervisors or a board of elections, just want to emphasize following that process for assessing whether or not X is safe for your office to engage with, or any of the other social media platforms as well. I think that connects to this question here. And thanks for those who are staying behind. We're taking a little bit more time to answer questions here on the back end. I know we're going over. So if you end up having to leave, this is all recorded and will be sent out later. But thanks for staying behind and asking your questions. Want to address this question, which is related to the last, which is, should election offices consider expanding to self-hosted federated social media like Mastodon or PeerTube? I think that I would just reemphasize what I said about vetting social media sites in whatever your internal processes look like for setting up new communications channels. But I'm curious if anybody on the panel has anything to add to that.
I'm always going to chime in with the bandwidth thing, because again, understanding that different jurisdictions have different amounts of time that they can even dedicate to this. Because the one thing with social media, you can't do it halfway. You have to be 10 toes in with it. So if you have the capacity to look at other platforms, and to echo Taryn's point, with the elections being a 50-state patchwork, you want to be able to run the necessary traps to see if there are any legal risks or any kind of extra exposure that it creates for your staff.
What I would add to this is, when considering going to a new platform, talk to your voters. Hear from them whether it's a platform that they use or something that they trust to get information. They can be your best roadmap, because ultimately you're using social media to reach your voters. And if they're not on platforms that you're considering, then perhaps your efforts could be better used elsewhere. So the more that you can prioritize platforms based on where you actually know, or you can surmise that your voters are, the better.
Thanks so much for asking, and thanks for answering, folks. I think we've got time for a couple more of these questions. We've got a question here. Do you recommend deleting posts about election specifics once the election is over?
In keeping with the fact that social media is supposed to be a conversation, I'd be really hesitant about deleting posts, because when you're talking social, those are just going to continue to move down the feed over time. Websites are the ones that, I specifically think that once you're done, say with, I'm going to use Colorado as an example, your June primary, again, leave that information up there, and then flip to what people need to know for the upcoming November. But also, and this is, I want to really echo something Taryn just mentioned, make sure that you are getting in touch with your county attorney, city attorney, in-house legal counsel, whoever it is, because a lot of people find themselves on the bad end of news stories due to First Amendment concerns about deleting comments and deleting posts. So I would advise real caution around that.
All right. Thanks for that answer. All right, we've got a question here. Face-to-camera creates a challenge when we have to translate them into 4 Section 203 languages, and in some cases in 5 additional California Elections Code Section 14201 languages. What are your thoughts on whether it's effective to translate the voiceover with election officials still on screen mouthing the words in English? I recently chose to just appear on camera for the short welcome and the short conclusion, and use B-roll through most of the video. So when it comes to face-to-camera, how do we feel? Voiceovers, captions, when it comes to translations?
I think the first step is to ask the question that you're asking, which is excellent, right? You're trying to think, how do I reach voters in my jurisdiction that speak different languages? And the fact that you're asking that question means that you're going to be able to find a solution that works for folks. You have a number of different options, as you mentioned, at your disposal. So you can use closed captioning and have those captions translated. You can kind of dub your video and have it won't actually be your voice, but it would be someone speaking in the different language, or increasingly with artificial intelligence, it could be your voice. Or you can use B-roll and have the different languages come through. I'm curious to hear what Alton would say about this. I think all of those options are creative, and the most important thing is that you're getting out the content in the different languages. I think that having captions is also helpful, because those captions can be interpreted by screen readers. So that language comes through in the language of the person that's receiving the content. Alton, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I was just going to agree with your answer when it comes to this, because, that would be a challenge, especially when you get into jurisdictions that have multiple languages. My former jurisdiction, of course, English and Spanish, but we also put out certain information in like 5 other languages because of the delays that happened with the processing of the 2020 census during the pandemic. So that is also a good place to, even if you do have to use multiple languages, I would suggest, in addition to using B-roll, would be to use just a slate with the key, like 3 or 4 bullet points in the responsive languages. So even if it doesn't totally track with what's being stated in English, as long as election day is November 5th, vote centers open on October 17th, as long as that key language appears in the written form, I still think that would give you some cover.
Awesome. Thanks for giving your thoughts on that one. And thanks for asking that thoughtful question. All right, I think we're almost clear of the questions, whether answered either directly to folks or answered live. This last question here is about whether or not Meta support link works for Instagram, since Instagram is also owned by Meta. I think that might be the case, but just looking to Leah maybe to confirm.
I'm pretty sure it does, and if it doesn't, then it includes prominently the corresponding link for Instagram at the top of that page.
Awesome. Thank you for confirming that. All right, I think we've done it. So thank you so much for those of you who stayed all the way to the end, for asking your questions, for engaging in this content, for thinking thoughtfully about the foundations of digital communications. And thanks, of course, again to Leah, Alton, Christian, and all of our sponsoring organizations and entities for putting this webinar on. We've got one more this time next week on building partnerships. So we'd be happy to see you again next week where we talk about that in detail. All right. Thank you, everyone.